this diversity of what we call permaculture is really the expressions of what permaculture is. The core of permaculture is really a design system, and we apply that design system to both the sustainable use of resources and our own ways of living. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation and the consumption side of the equation, and how we bring those two back together. It's based on universal ethics and design principles. We see these as applicable everywhere, in any context, but the strategies and techniques will vary enormously from one situation to another. Permaculture is also a grassroots and international movement of practitioners, designers and organisations. Finn's already mentioned that it has a history and lineage in New Zealand. We're actually in New Zealand as part of 6 months away from home on a teaching and study tour that's taking us mostly in Latin America, and tomorrow we're flying to Brazil, partly for the 8th International Permaculture Conference, which is being held in Brazil this year. I understand there's 11 permaculture institutes in Brazil. In a lot of ways, permaculture activism is deeper and stronger in many developing countries than it is in affluent countries. I also see permaculture as really an empowering process for reclaiming our place in nature, not as some sort of vague, fuzzy, romantic idea, but a very practical, pragmatic one. Okay, so if we look back at the history of permaculture, it really began with the publication of this book in 1978, and there is actually an older history in New Zealand than what Finn referred to that predates the permaculture design process too, because I came here in 1979 at the invitation of Hakai Tane, and we actually set up Permaculture New Zealand together in 1979. At that time it was working as an agent of influence, if you like, or an agent of very positive influence through 3 organisations that New Zealand already had, which were addressing maybe related issues: the Soil Association, Farm Forestry Association and the Tree Crops Association. This time was a period where there was a huge general interest in what we might broadly call sustainable alternatives. This was part of what I call the first wave of modern environmentalism. And what was really driving that was the energy crises of 1973 and 1979, which almost by chance seemed to highlight the very controversial and well-publicised Club of Rome Limits to Growth report, which was published in 1972, which had suggested that if industrial society continued on its path, it would run into fundamental resource limits sometime in the first part of the 21st century. Now, of course, by the early 1980s, energy was again cheap. The Thatcherite Reaganite revolution had kick-started the Western economies again, and a lot of the mainstream concern about these issues faded away. A lot of the research in universities was abandoned, and it was sort of back to business as usual. I suppose similarly we could see that interest in permaculture tended to not disappear but consolidate, and mostly consolidate as an alternative lifestyle back to the land movement. By the mid-1980s, there was another fundamental crisis brewing, or awareness of it, in the form of the scientific consensus around global warming. That's really when that consensus emerged, the mid-1980s. And that led to what I call the second great wave of modern environmental activism, and that coincided with the publication of Bill Mollison's Encyclopedic Designer's Manual in 1988. Again, there was huge interest in permaculture, and a lot of this analysis is really an Australian perspective, but it has had its parallel in New Zealand and many other countries. I date the end of this period as being 1992, ironically the year of the Rio Earth Summit. And that was a time when oil was again very cheap. We had the internet and computer revolution starting to provide a foundation for this new radical idea that maybe we could have continuous economic growth without actually using more materials and resources. This idea called the weightless economy. Sort of turned out to be a bit of a farce really, but it had a lot of credence at that time. So again, the 1990s was a relatively barren period. By the late 1990s, I sensed that there was a third wave of environmentalism brewing around these two great crises coming together in the form of real climate change and the big one in the form of the imminent peaking of global oil supply. And that's coincided with the publication of Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which embarrassingly we only have a display copy here with us at the moment due to those just-in-time logistics supply problems. In this book, I'm really placing permaculture at the centre of the sustainability debate rather than being seen as some sort of peripheral lifestyle or curious form of organic gardening. So, if we step back from the current situation and look at energy futures in terms of a historical timeline that stretches back to the beginnings of agriculture, up through the Industrial Revolution to the baby boom, we can see that energy and resource use is paralleled by population growth and pollution and environmental impact. And they pretty much follow this pattern from more or less sustainable pre-industrial cultures up through the industrial ascent period where we created the culture of modernism to the present time where we've arrived at a sort of a postmodern cultural chaos, I suppose, where we're uncertain about the future, uncertain about the possibilities. So if we think about that future, not in terms of years, but maybe in terms of the great-grandchildren or the time it takes for an old-growth forest to mature, this is really a very short timeline compared with the historical timeline, but it's almost mind-bogglingly long for modern minds to grapple with. I see that future in terms of 4 possible scenarios. Now, these scenarios are not primarily decisions or choices we make. They are emergent characteristics based on available energy in the same way that the industrialisation process was because we tapped hundreds of millions of years of stored sunlight in the form of fossil fuels. So the first scenario I call techno-explosion, and this is the stuff of science fiction. This is all of these possibilities of genetic engineering, of artificial intelligence, all really depend on a huge, new, effectively free source of energy in some form. There's been endless talk about this for the last 60 years, at least. It's getting very, very late in the day for something to emerge to be this. Of course, there will be increasing talk about these possibilities. I remember being promised holidays to Mars when I was a child, but they haven't eventuated yet. So the point about this scenario is if there was some huge new free energy